Hey everyone, this is Shpan, and in this video we're going to be discussing some interesting game design choices in a pretty obscure RPG that I recently played called Dungeon Lords. Dungeon Lords is an action RPG that was released in 2005 by a team called Heuristic Park, and after a little research it's somewhat unclear to me if they're still around today, though it has been some years since their last game released. Dungeon Lords has received a few different releases, most recently being the 2015 release on Steam, which is the version that I personally played. Dungeon Lords is an interesting title. It's pure fantasy wonder that captures that nostalgic feeling of adventure, an amalgamation of all sorts of different inspirations like what we might see in more standard fantasy fare, but also with some unique touches and creative ideas that makes it very difficult to compare it to other games. In many ways, it reminds me of Elder Scrolls titles by having that sense of open world freedom, with a combat system that blends real-time action with heavy reliance on stats determining in the background whether or not strikes connect, or if an enemy dodges or misses, and all other sorts of combat interactions. But the real magic of this game is its sense of adventure, and use of game design choices that are sorely missed by gamers like me in 2025 fantasy RPGs. The game is definitely rough around the edges in many ways, but I tend to find that sometimes older and less polished games often came with a lot of personality and a greater ability to execute on the team's vision. There were plenty of unique ideas in this game, but it really shines in how it presents pure fantasy goodness. And that's to say, Dungeon Lords is a game that surprised me by capturing a somewhat sword and sorcery fantasy feeling, where the main narrative and the world building isn't explicitly the focus of the game, but rather is about providing a sense of adventure in a fantasy world with fun story moments and action scenes that bring to life many of the comfy and indulgent aspects of the fantasy genre that fans like myself have really missed in many recent titles. In this video, I want to take a closer look at some of the specific design choices that I really enjoyed, and talk a little bit about why the game, despite having many issues, really resonated with me. Dungeon Lords is absolutely not a game that every fan of RPGs is going to enjoy. And this video isn't even really an endorsement of the game or me recommending it to everyone watching. This video is more about discussing the game design and systems that I found interesting and enjoyed, and really wish more modern RPGs would try to capture, and also to remind gamers that many of these older design choices have value today and to approach them with less of a critical lens. We can learn a lot from how many small development teams during the late 90s and early to mid 2000s depicted and presented fantasy flavor, RPG systems, and how they captured the feeling of adventure. I feel deeply that many modern RPGs are losing what made fantasy RPGs great, and what made it a beautiful form of escapism. With all of that being said, let's start talking about game design. Dungeon Lords is a masterclass on skill design. Player is given usually 3 skill points when leveling up to place in any of the skills that are available to their class or classes. There are a lot of skills to choose from, and skills in this game often have many different unexpected applications. Even non-combat skills might be relevant to specific dungeon designs, enemy encounters, or might affect resource management in ways you might not have anticipated. What makes skills work so well in this game is that even seemingly niche skills can have massive payoff if heavily invested into them. Let's talk about a few of these skills in closer detail. First on that list of skills is lockpicking and bashing. Opening locked chests and doors is really well designed and has a surprising amount of depth to it. First, you have a lockpicking skill, which is a minigame where the meter passes through different mechanical looking locks, and you need to hit the matching image before it moves on to the next piece. The higher your lockpicking skill, the slower the meter will move, giving you more time to recognize the matching image and press it in time. There's also an inspect skill, which is separate from lockpicking. The higher this skill, the clearer the image is before making a lockpicking attempt, which will give you an idea of when the matching image will appear in the sequence. There's a lot of variety. Some high-level locked chests might require 3 matching images in a sequence, and some easier chests might only require 1. But for those that aren't rogues, you also have a bash option. And interestingly, bash is actually a skill you need to invest skill points into when leveling up. When bashing, you skip the lockpicking minigame entirely, and instead need to fill a percentage bar with each bash attempt. The higher your skill in bashing, the more percentage you'll gain towards unlocking a chest or door per attempt. Bashing can trigger traps multiple times, so mashing it can easily get you killed if your bash skill is too low. Bashing also comes with the added risk of completely jamming a locked chest, door, or any other locked container like a cabinet in a person's home. The higher your skill in bashing, the lower the amount of bashing attempts you'll need, which lowers your chance to jam a lock. Any container that becomes jammed is forever locked. I really enjoyed how well thought out this is and how interesting it is to interact with, especially because there are a lot of locked chests with valuable equipment and consumables in this game. And throughout my Dwarf Rune Fighter playthrough, I invested a ton of skill points into the bash skill, which paid off massively for me. This is a really well designed way to deal with locked containers or doors. There's multiple ways to go about it. Some ways are more active while others are more passive, and there's value when investing into the related skills. And there were even other benefits for expertise in bashing or lockpicking, as there's a dungeon later in the game where a super high level ghost spirit that is pretty much unkillable will chase you around a maze, and you need to collect 4 gems to unlock the gate, but they're hidden among a bunch of locked chests. Being able to quickly bash them open so the spirit can't reach you and kill you was a super unexpected benefit to my investment into the bash skill. Overall, I was really impressed with how the developers approached dealing with locked chests and doors, and I would love to see more games create more thoughtful designs like this. Another well-implemented system that relates to skills is the weapon and armor durability and repairs. It's not uncommon in this game for most of your equipment or your weapon to lose all of its durability during a single dungeon delving time frame. Often you won't be able to finish a dungeon before more than half of your armor and your weapon loses all of its durability. You'll be shocked at how quickly shield durability will drain when blocking a lot, but you can quickly see the vision for the way it's implemented when you understand that it's meant to be a resource management system that makes preparation important for dungeon delving. Equipment that loses all of its durability isn't destroyed, but you no longer receive its armor bonus, and weapons without durability have their damage significantly reduced. To repair armor and weapons, you need to either visit a shop and pay for a repair fee, or use a repair kit, which there are different levels of quality, like for example a master repair kit or magic repair kit. There are a finite amount that shops have for sale, and so it's an important resource throughout the game that you can't easily hoard. But like many systems in this game, there is a skill relevant to it. You can invest skill points when leveling up into the repair skill to improve the amount of durability repaired when using a repair kit, and what's even more interesting is that it reduces the chance that a repair kit will be consumed when using it. So with high enough skill, it's possible to be able to make use of a single master repair kit multiple times. The more reliably you can use repair kits in dungeons without consuming that resource, the more you can make use of your strongest weapons and armor without needing to swap it out with weaker weapons to save durability. Enemies often drop their weapons in dungeons, and so you can often make use of what the enemy drops when needing to save some durability for your more powerful options. It's a pretty interesting design choice, and I like how investing into the repair skill makes a finite resource more freely usable and also more effective. The player has control of sacrificing more combat-relevant skills for a skill that allows for more consistent use of their best equipment. That's pretty cool. There's a similar skill called scroll reading that functions like the repair skill. Scrolls are usually a one-time use consumable that casts a specific spell. But with a high enough scroll reading skill, it's possible to get a bunch of uses out of a single spell scroll. And if you happen to find a spell scroll that's really powerful, that your class doesn't even normally have access to, it doesn't matter. You're able to circumvent this restriction with proper investment into the scroll reading skill. It's really an awesomely designed system and really flavorful. Moving on to my next topic, I want to talk a bit about class fantasy design. I chose a Dwarf Rune Fighter as my race and class, and really enjoyed the flavor of this class. In Dungeon Lords, the class system is a little bit confusing, but in total, you can combine up to 5 different classes to make your build. Up to 2 Tier 1 classes, 2 Tier 2 classes, and 1 Tier 3 class. If you refer to this chart here, the class system makes a little bit more sense. Basically, you choose a core class at character creation, which is also classified as a Tier 1 class. Later, through joining one of 4 major factions, you can add one more Tier 1 class to your character. And through those factions, there are Tier 2 classes you can eventually qualify for, but there are also a few minor factions that provide Tier 2 classes, and you're restricted to 2 Tier 2 classes in total, which makes for a lot of potential combinations in build variety. Each class has the potential to add a ton of functionality to your build, as some make entirely new types of weapons or armor types available to you, and others might unlock entire schools of magic for your character. The combination of what you selected for your Tier 1 classes presents most of which Tier 2 classes are available. For example, a fighter with an adept, which is similar to a cleric, would make a Tier 2 class called Paladin as a possible option. Smaller factions like the Eastern Houses provide Tier 2 classes like the Samurai if you have the prerequisite of the Tier 1 Fighter class, or a Ninja Lord if you have the Tier 1 Rogue class. And interestingly enough, the Tier 1 class you chose at character creation is called your Core class, and you get slightly unique properties on your Core class skills. So a character that chose a fighter at level 1, for example, has a different property on their core skills than a mage that later chose fighter as their second Tier 1 class. It's pretty interesting. As you can imagine, there's a lot of combinations available for the player to build around. I think it's a few hundred, but my math could be wrong there. The spell designs are interesting as well, although one criticism I have, at least for the Rune Fighter, is that there were too many buff spells for my taste to the beginning half of the game, which led to me not having as many active skills as I'd like. Though overall, I really enjoyed the Rune Fighter class fantasy and flavor. It's a concept I don't see done too often in RPGs, and it's a really good fit for dwarves in my opinion. While on the topic of my Dwarf Rune Fighter, there was one spell in particular that I found super interesting that I want to talk about real quick called Rune Shield. In this game, you can wear a shield and a one-handed weapon, but I was using a two-handed axe for my character. But activating the Rune Shield creates a small magical arm shield, similar to a buckler, and allowed me to block as if I had a shield equipped while still having the two-handed axe equipped, as you can see here. And the animation was as if I was using a shield, and I thought that was really well done. It lasts about 30 seconds and has a pretty long cooldown, so it doesn't replace the main benefit of a one-handed weapon being able to equip a shield, but it's a really interesting spell concept that I don't think I've ever seen in another game. A temporary magical shield that the player can have access to while using a two-handed weapon. If you've seen something like it in a different RPG, definitely let me know in the comments. Next up, we'll talk about dungeon design. Dungeon design is really nice in this game. There's a pretty big emphasis on dungeon delving, and most major story points lead to really large dungeons. Of course, they're nowhere near as large as Daggerfall, but by the mid-game, they start to get pretty big. The developers' use of lighting and color really go a long way in building a great atmosphere in this game's dungeons. I feel this is an often overlooked aspect of dungeon design and really interior design in general in games. But look at these dark purple and dark blue interior lighting here. To me, it really captures a retro fantasy atmosphere, and reminds me a bit of a location you might see out of a Boris Vallejo fantasy painting. Lighting and color choice is a major part of evoking atmosphere, or even subtly evoking emotions that can bring new interpretations of the space that might not otherwise be felt by the player. Dungeon Lords takes advantage of that by making some spaces feel almost horror adjacent, like this maze-like tome that has diminished light sources, dark blues, and purples. Other than a great atmosphere, dungeons have tons of secret switches, hidden doors, valuable loot, and even makes use of platforming and puzzles in order to progress. They have great gameplay variety. Wherever you go and whoever you talk to, there is a sense of unpredictability, because it doesn't follow many of the conventions you might expect from other RPGs, whether they be more indie titles or AAA titles. The game does not bombard you with 50 side quests of questionable quality, but instead a small select few without quest markers or highlighted sections of the map. Just through conversation or sometimes paying a bartender for specific information can give you the details needed to figure out how to advance a quest. NPCs do this interesting thing where they don't just wait for the player to interact with them, they often run towards you if the situation calls for it. Like, for example, a waitress working at a tavern might come towards you to see if you'd like to order something, or a soldier guarding a building might run towards you if you're passing by to identify who you are before letting you be on your way. It's an interesting design space for NPCs that I can't easily compare with other games. It's a pretty unique detail. And speaking of NPC design, the game also surprised me with some of its voice acting, both in the quality of the performances and in the amount of voice-acted characters I interacted with.
You make bold claim to recover the lost Argalia of Ereldorn, yet you confess uncertainty of its whereabouts and petition the assistance of House Phaethian to help you. I sternly warn you not to make a mockery of this court and the Council of Elders. House of Phaethian, what say you to this stranger's request?
The quality of the writing is also pretty good. with decent characterization for many NPCs and sometimes providing world building without focusing too heavily on the latter, so as to prevent over-explaining the world to the player and in doing so diminishing the sense of wonder and mystery in the fantasy world. Earlier, I used the sword and sorcery genre as a comparison point for this game because it's filled with story moments that set up epic fight scenes and opportunities for awesome combat feats. It really evokes the spirit of Conan the Barbarian stories and how he'd often find himself in similar situations. Like this instance here, for example, where I came to a fort on diplomatic terms, but found the lords conspiring to end the investigation into the missing artifact by killing me and using his position of public trust to explain away my death as an accident. Watch as he reveals his plan and activates a switch that allows for his throne to retreat behind a secret door and commands his entire garrison of guards to kill me. It really feels like a scene straight out of a sword and sorcery novel. It's fun when fantasy RPGs lean into this style of fantasy. It embraces that retro fantasy feeling and set up epic story moments and action scenes. And of course, his fortress is a massive dungeon that I'm now free to explore, find his secret hiding place, put an end to his treachery, and while doing so, investigate where that stolen artifact is. The context for dungeon delving is often really fun in this game. Enemy design is pretty good as well in this game. I won't go too deep into it, but Dungeon Lords has a lot of enemy variety, and some cool interactions between specific enemy types and player abilities. For example, stunning a flying enemy will drop it to the ground, making it much easier to hit for melee builds. And some enemies make awesome use of their environment. Check out these slime enemies that can only move across the surface of water, encouraging the player to swim underneath the water, and again, the game provides value where you might not have expected to find it for more niche skill options like athletics, which among other things increase swimming capabilities. The enemy design plays well off of skill selections and player spells and abilities. I don't have too much to say about itemization in this game. It's decent, but nothing too crazy. Perhaps more important than interesting items is making sure that when rare drops happen, they feel appropriately strong, and that's definitely the case in this game. Rare drops are rare, but when you get one, it feels great because they're super good and you'll likely be wearing it for a very long time. Like this ring for example here, huge amount of stats, but also gives my character a new active skill that I can use as long as the ring is equipped, a fire strike for my melee weapon. And now compare that ring to the type of rings I was finding throughout the entire playthrough. Itemization is definitely good enough to be exciting and satisfying. Although I enjoyed this game a lot, there are plenty of things that I felt missed the mark or were ideas that weren't explored well in my opinion. If you play it today, it requires some time to get used to the game feel and the controls, but that's not at all to say that they're poorly designed. And these days, I hear the word janky often to describe games like this. It's often seen as a way to almost playfully criticize a game, where the reviewer doesn't want to necessarily call the game bad, but instead uses janky as a synonym for trying to say a game feels different from games made today. I feel it's so often used to describe games that don't have the polish of AAA titles, old or new, and have design choices that might not be seen much in games these days anymore. But that really doesn't say anything about the quality of those game design choices, just that they feel antiquated because they're different from today's gaming standards. But personally, I don't think many of those standardized game design elements in either AAA RPGs or even indie RPGs are often that good. And so in general, I really don't like this word when describing games like this. It's more accurate to me to describe these types of games as leaning into design that doesn't conform with what games with wider audience appeal have chosen. And in doing so, moves away from the idea that these design choices are worse or awkward, but just simply different. And in being different will resonate with different players that may enjoy the style of game, even if that specific audience is much smaller than the wider gaming player base. Not every game needs mass appeal, and it's actually a great thing to have this variety available to us because people have different gaming tastes. It's really all about taste, and personally I tend to enjoy games that are designed like this. There is a sense of passion in the work, and I like that it takes its story and D&D inspiration seriously, while leaning into the sword and sorcery fantasy vibe and allowing Dungeon Lords to evoke a really great sense of adventure and mystery. It does this without needing to provide the player with a deeper analysis of the political or military movements of the powerful groups at play. Instead, we're given a localized adventure, focused more on the player character and their role-playing choices in a fantasy world that captures the imagination well and plays off of its strengths in a successful way. It accomplishes this by a combination of small inclusions that are becoming more and more scarce in fantasy RPG games today. Things like a wide range of different races available to the player, some beast-like and unique to this universe, not always leaning on the fantasy genre staples. Creating a combat system that takes inspiration from action games and MMO-style combat like Dark Age of Camelot. This combination produces a unique combat feel that makes it really difficult to compare it to another game. Traversal is fun. You can climb on ledges, and the game makes use of platforming sections and alternative ways to solve the navigation of a dungeon through climbing and platforming. You can dive deep down into rivers and lakes, climb mountains or dungeon ledges, and so there's really a surprising amount of freedom of movement to navigate your surroundings. And throughout the wilderness map, exploration stays interesting because you really don't ever develop a sense of what to expect. It feels inspired by pen and paper D&D, where at any moment something strange or interesting can be presented to the player, and you'll find yourself surprised often at how these events unfold. Sometimes the story of the event is not explained to the player and so filled in by the player's imagination. This game understands that sometimes in fantasy it's better to tell a regional story by not explicitly telling a story at all, but through using interesting imagery and developing the mystery of what really took place in an area. To me, this is an important aspect of fantasy works in general, not just in games. Exploration is designed with the proper amount of unexpected outcomes and events, and differs from the sort of predictable game loop that I've seen other RPGs fall into for the sake of creating a balanced experience for the player, where nothing particularly striking, confusing, or dangerous ever happens to the player, but instead story moments and events are controlled to always be within a Goldilocks range of what they feel gamers will find an acceptable amount of difficulty. Dungeon Lords doesn't operate in this predictable way. You'll often come across challenges you can't overcome, puzzles that you momentarily abandon because they're confusing, or secrets that you can't find a way to access, though you know they're there. Not every obstacle presented to the player should fall into a predictable level of challenge. Some things should be above that threshold, and in doing so, those moments will become memorable to the player when they eventually find a creative way to solve it, or it will be just as memorable if they needed to move on and it remains an unconquerable challenge for them. I wish more RPG developers would not worry themselves with the idea that challenges and thoughtful puzzles or secrets will frustrate their player base, and so they need to design them in a way that doesn't stimulate their players' brains at all. Instead, develop the challenges or obstacles in your game to have different levels of difficulty. Some things can be more easily conquerable, and other things may require the player to simply move on and accept that not everything in this world is going to be theirs. I think players will appreciate this design philosophy and feel more immersed in a world that is presented in this way. Dungeon Lords often does a great job at capturing this design philosophy. Dungeon Lords is a part of an era of fantasy RPG games that wanted to introduce new ideas and systems into the genre. It's a game that throughout your playthrough will continue to surprise you in many ways while providing that sense of wonder that fantasy is all about. Heuristic Park is a team I have a lot of respect for, and I would have loved to see more games from these developers. I know this is a different style of video than what I normally make on this channel here, but I wanted to cover this overlooked title and discuss the interesting game design choices in it that I really appreciated. I think as fans of Daggerfall, many of my subscribers might enjoy this game as well. Thanks for watching everyone, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. Take care.